All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the December 2022 meeting for the Chicago Data Professionals. My name is Jared Karney, and I am going to talk a bit tonight for about an hour on migrating up to Azure, your SQL database. So I titled this Ground Control to Major Tom. Why? Strictly because I was trying to come up with a clever title and I couldn't think of anything. And I was like, well, what if let's see, we're talking about like we got the clouds. Is there something about the clouds? Da, 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 da. And I don't know, this song just popped into my head, right? And really, what is this all about, migrating into the cloud? We have to have some type of control station on the ground, wherever we're migrating from. In most cases, when we're talking about migration, we're talking about our on-prem or private cloud into the public cloud. And so that's why I started to think even more so, that's really what this is, right? We have to set up this kind of like ground control, this control center, and have a spot where we can monitor, we can initiate, we can administer, we can do all that good stuff to push everything up into the cloud. And really that's what Azure SQL Migration Extension for Azure Data Studio does for us. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. First of all, why use a tool versus manually do it, right? We got a SQL Server. We take backups, we restore it, right? We copy them, restore it. Yeah, you can. And in a virtual machine, that works, right? But it's still a manual process. And if you want to do it over an extended amount of time, because you don't have the option of shutting everything down, taking a final backup, waiting for those backups to copy, especially for large databases, restore them to your VM, and then bring everything back online, maybe some type of tool that could automate that for you would be helpful. In the case of Azure SQL Managed Instance, again, you can restore backups, but it's a little bit more tedious because we don't have this server. Where are we restoring them from? Okay, it's a little bit more tedious in relationship to what you're used to doing with a simple copy and restore, but it can be done. Same problems exist though as for the VM. And then Azure SQL DB. Well, Azure SQL DB, you cannot restore backup files, right? In fact, the way that you have to migrate is you have to export the data through like a data tier application or a backpack file, which a backpack file contains all of the data in the schema, and then push it up into Azure. And so that's why it's great to have a tool. What tool are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about Azure Data Studio. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. We'll talk about the Azure SQL Migration Extension, which is what we're going to add into that tool. We'll talk about that architecture and process for that extension. A little bit about the prerequisites. I'm not going to get too much into Azure security because there's a number of different ways that you can do it, and they're all well documented online based upon the platform that you're going to be migrating to. And so it's just kind of a waste of my time to talk about it here. And then I'll go into a demo. We'll run through the process A to Z, which hopefully doesn't take too long, because I will be literally installing the extension, installing something called the self-hosted integration runtime, which we'll learn more a little bit. Backups are small though, so that should be quick. So why should I use a tool? The easy button, right? We've all seen that on a commercial for a particular store, right? It's an easy button. It's just easier. And this particular tool that I'm going to talk about is really easy, because we used to have to actually go into Azure and create a particular service, but we don't even have to do that anymore. It'll provision it for us in the tool. Okay. Right? The other cool things about this tool is we're going to get an assessment report. Right, so we're going to see, first of all, what types of features are we using, if any, that we may have to alter or work around when we move this into Azure. 9 times out of 10, you're not going to see any of those conflicts when you're moving to Azure SQL virtual machine or to Azure SQL managed instance. So for those of you who don't know, the Azure SQL managed instance is basically SQL Server, like you typically install without Windows. So you're just not managing Windows, but you can log in through SQL Server Management Studio and do all the same kinds of things you used to do until you start saying, run this CMD and look at the drives, because there are no drives for you to look at. It will migrate and assess IaaS and PaaS. And for those of you, again, who don't know, IaaS is infrastructure as a service. So that would be our virtual machines. And then PaaS offerings would be SQL Managed Instance and Azure SQL DB. And they both have kind of their own little flavors, such as elastic pools and hyperscale. That assessment report will also tell us which of those 3 versions we are ready for. So you'll see that. And then lastly, we've got an online and an offline version to do this. So that's the nice thing about the tool. I'll talk about what that means. We'll get a visual status report. So as this migration is ongoing, we can see what's going on. Oh, backups are happening. Backups are being copied. Backups are being restored. Backups are done being restored. Here is the last backup that was restored. Here is the log sequence number if you really want to dig that deep. So let me take a step back. Online versus offline. When we talk about online versus offline, the main difference there is that the online migration is going to keep your production instance online throughout the backup restore process. So you can let this go for weeks if you needed to kind of build that, that kind of log shipping style scenario where you have the database being restored over time until you're fully ready to do that cutover. Now, the online version does still mean that when you do the cutover, you're going to have a little bit of a network blip during that cutover. How you handle that, there's multiple ways you can handle that with CNAMEs, DNS aliases, ultimately the same thing there. Having new applications that might already be in Azure instead of on-prem, so you're just using new application servers and turning them on, right? But the offline migration will stop and cut access to your source database from the moment it starts, and it will not really get it back on the source. Once it's complete, you'll redirect everything to the target, or you may have already done that. Okay, so that's the difference between online and offline. So let's talk a little bit about the tool. The tool is Azure Data Studio. And Azure Data Studio does a lot more than just migrate SQL databases. Okay? It's a cross-platform database tool. What does that mean? Well, SQL Server Management Studio, can you install it on a Mac? Sure, if you're running Windows in a virtual machine or some type of emulator. I don't know, I'm not a Mac person, so I don't know. But I do have friends that use Macs, and I know at some level they have to imitate or emulate Windows. All right, so Azure Data Studio is cross-platform. It's modern. What does that mean? It means it's got IntelliSense. It means that we can save code snippets and use that kind of as a part of IntelliSense. Sorry. We also have the ability to integrate it with source control. It has an interactive terminal that you can open up and run CMD, PowerShell. I believe you may even be able to run Bash in that terminal. Don't quote me on that. I'm not a Bash guy. We can run notebooks. Anybody who use notebooks, Python notebooks? You can create notebooks with these markdown language and actually create little cells. It works great for training. Hey, here's what we're going to do in text, And the next cell is a connection code snippet to a SQL database or to your Python environment or your Spark environment, right? So that's how notebooks work. I'm not going to dwell on that. It's in here. You look it up. It's a query editor, much like SQL Server Management Studio, right? We've got a connection manager, so we can add connections, save them, save our credentials. You can create dashboards, multi-language support like Python. Loads of extensions created both by Microsoft and the community and other Microsoft partners. So this is the architecture and the process, right? And again, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but what we're doing is we're specifying a source for our databases that we want to assess and migrate. We're going to tell it where those backups are located for those servers. You can use an existing file share, or you can create a new one. I was recently working with a customer who was using a backup appliance. And so in this particular case, we had to retrieve the backups from that appliance and put them out to a file share. Right? It turns out that appliance, they can script a job that'll regularly do that for them during their production migration scenario, which again, could be over several weeks. So they could do that. The next thing you'll see there is the self-hosted integration runtime. It says number 6, right? But what that's doing is that's connecting your on-prem file share to Azure, right? And then we're going to push those backups using that integration runtime up into Azure, and then we'll restore them. Lastly, what we can do is we can cut over. So there's a button I can push in the tool that says cut over this database. When it does that, it will restore, like do a final restore of that last database or transaction log, I should say, and bring the database online, right? Basically, restore database with recovery. That's it, right? That brings it back online. So that's the process, right, in general. Now I've got too many hands. One's holding a microphone, one's holding my pointer. So let's see. All right, so some notes, right? If you are pre-SQL Server 2008, this is not going to work. If you're 2005, which gosh, I hope you're not, but I know they're still out there, you're going to have to upgrade that to at least 2008 in order to use this tool. Okay. Like I said earlier, online migration doesn't mean zero downtime. It means less downtime. Okay. It's going to keep your production database up and running as we are taking backups and restoring to the new service up in Azure, whether that's a VM or SQL managed instance, right? So it's applying the logs. When we do the cutover, we're going to have to cut that network connection, and that'll happen. Okay. Offline migration will take the source offline as soon as the migration begins. So don't take this tool, point it to a production database, assess it with an offline migration, and click start. All of a sudden, your users will no longer be able to access your source databases, right? So if you are going to use that, make sure it's during the maintenance window that you are planning for this production migration. The Azure SQL database target. Okay, for those of you who don't know, Azure SQL DB is a PaaS offering, and it is a single contained database. And we can't restore logs, which means we can't do an online migration. Okay. It's also still in preview. And also the Azure SQL database target requires a database already existing in Azure with a deployed schema. We don't need that database in our virtual machine or SQL managed instance because we have an instance that we can restore a database to. In Azure SQL DB, we're literally exporting the data and then putting the data back into an empty shell of a database. All right, so the prerequisites. Well, of course, we're going to need Azure Data Studio with the SQL migration extension installed. We're also going to need a source SQL Server, of course, because we're going to migrate from somewhere. We're going to need a target that's a platform in Azure, whether that's a virtual machine, a managed instance, or Azure SQL DB. We're going to need a location to hold our backups for the online migration with VM and managed instance. And we're going to need a certain level of Azure permissions. As I said, I would provide a link in the slide because those permissions change based on what you're restoring to or what you're migrating to. They're very well documented. I haven't had a problem with them. What I suggest during a migration process is for you to have a relatively high level of permissions as the person doing this. Doesn't mean you need to keep those permissions when the migration is done, right? But I'm a big fan of just-in-time access. Companies say, oh, we can't give them sysadmin. No. Well, you're not giving it to them forever, but give them the ability to troubleshoot issues on this new production instance, right, during this process. So before I go into the demo, are there any questions about what I've talked about? Russ. The question is, have I seen this in action migrating to a PaaS solution? Yes. So in fact, the demo that I'm going to do, we're going to migrate to managed instance. Okay, so the other PaaS solution, have I seen it in action to Azure SQL DB? Yes, I have. And what it does is it creates an export and basically handles it for you. But it does it all offline, which means when I click start, it's going to export the data, copy it up, import the data. Yeah, which I can do manually as well. What I'm getting here is kind of a wizard to help me walk through that process. And at the same time, giving me some type of status updates. Did that answer your question? Okay, great, cool. All right, so any other questions? Whether remotely or not? Okay, cool. So let me jump in out of that and we will come over here to where I have my Azure Data Studio. So I'm going to go ahead and start up my Azure Data Studio. Okay. And for those of you who are familiar with some of Microsoft's newer tools, you see a very familiar interface with icons on the left here that show me some of the different options or panes that I can work with, right? So if I want to look at notebooks, I can click here. If I want to look at my source control, I could link it here. And the last one, these little blocks, are going to be my extensions. I'm sorry, the top one here was my connection manager. So much like your object explorer in SQL Server Management Studio, where you make connections to your servers, that's up here in the upper left. You can see that it's persisted. None of them are connected right now, but as soon as I click on one, it's going to initiate my connection. And now I'm connected to my managed instance in Azure. Again, SQL Managed Instance is basically an instance of SQL Server without Windows. So we don't have a file system that we interact with, but we do have SQL Server Agent. We have Service Broker. And we have, of course, the database engine. The other thing I'm going to connect to here is my local instance of SQL Server 2019. I'm not going to use SQL Server 2022 just for now, because the instance that I have was probably an older dev version before they went GA a couple weeks ago. Okay. So right now, if I were to go to my database, right click and go to manage, this is my local instance, or let's say on-prem instance of SQL Server. I can see my databases here. I can see kind of like a little dashboard here of my instance, right? We can see a backup status. 7 of them are older than 24 hours. Okay, well, that makes sense. I haven't really backed this up because it's my own dev instance. And then we can see a little size, right? So these are just some of the default graphs that are placed on the dashboard. Once I install my extension for migration, you're going to see another option down here. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll jump over here. Okay, to my extensions. And you can see I've got one extension installed. It's my managed instance dashboard, which I just found the other day. It's pretty cool. We're going to skip over that, and we're going to add the SQL migration, right? So you can see the Azure SQL migration extension. Again, a very familiar kind of Visual Studio code interface. So I'll click on install. And now it's installed. It's that simple. The nice thing about this too is as you scroll down here, you'll see links to documentation. This is all very well documented. You will also see this documentation as I step back to click on my connections, manage. Oh, I'm going to close my manage tab because it's got to reload the extension. So I don't have to restart Azure Data Studio, but I will have to reopen my manage. And now you can see right here under general, right? Here's my Azure SQL migration extension. So I'll go ahead and click on that. Once again, we've got a dashboard tab, so some tabs up here. This is a dashboard for me to start with. And then here's my migrations. I don't have any active migrations, so it's blank, right? I just installed this. Click back here to dashboard. Again, number of different links down here for tutorials. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a new migration. How do I do that? I can click on the new migration button. I can click on the migrate to Azure SQL button. So I'll go ahead and click here. And now I get a wizard that's going to help me walk through this. All right. It's already found the databases because I did this through the manage section of my instance. So I would have connected to my SQL Server on-prem, right-clicked, manage. These are the databases that are there. I'm going to go ahead and select all of them. Okay. And click next. Boom, that's the assessment. Now, mind you, my databases aren't very big, right? But what it's doing is it's going out there, it's looking at the databases, looking at the schemas. It's also going through and inspecting my assumption, because it's reading through your stored procedures and objects, is it's probably going out to like SQL modules, the DMV or the system table that's holding all of the definition language for all of your objects and looking for compatibility issues. And what you'll see here is that for SQL managed instance, 6 out of 7 can be migrated without issues. For virtual machine, as I mentioned, all of them can be migrated without issues. That's because it's basically 1 for 1, right? Windows SQL, Windows SQL. And then the last one is Azure SQL DB, which I said is a contained database, which means things like linked server references, 4-part naming conventions, things like that that reference another database that isn't there, can't be used, right? So I've got some databases that clearly use some of those other features. Well, let's take a look at these reports. I can click on each one of these. So I selected Azure SQL Managed Instance, and then I can come down and click on View Select for View My Assessment Results. Okay. Now, personally, I'm going to look at that maybe before I look at this Get Azure recommendation. The get Azure recommendation is, like I said a little bit earlier, a SKU recommendation. How many vCores do I need for my SQL managed instance? Right? What virtual machine should I pick for this workload based on these performance metrics? Okay. That is also in preview, but I'm going to skip that. I'm going to click on View Select so I can look at these databases. And what I can see is, first of all, at the instance level for my SQL managed instance, there's no issues. Okay. As I scroll down over here on the left, I can see that my data warehouse does have an issue. All right, well, what is it? I'll click on it. Right, and it tells me right away what that is. Azure SQL Managed Instance, general purpose service tier, does not support in-memory OLTP. Well, I haven't picked a service tier yet. So this is giving me a warning. Jared, if you do not pick the right SKU for your SQL Managed Instance, you won't be able to migrate this in-memory table. If you're not using the in-memory feature, just get rid of it, right? Which in some cases, probably not an in-memory table, but there might be some like objects that might be found that are using like XP command shell for Azure SQL DB, and you might be like, oh, we're not really using that anymore. We know we can't use it there. It's a legacy object, right? So we'll ignore it. The point is, this is bringing to your attention what's going on, okay? This does also show me the objects that use in memory. And then a recommendation. Okay. So let's take a look at Azure SQL Database. I'm not going to migrate there tonight, but if we look at this, we're going to see a lot more issues. Right? Like, first of all, here on this one. Right? Cross-database queries are not supported. Okay? That's a big deal. If I'm doing cross-database queries, I either need to change the way that I consume data from this database from other databases, or maybe I have to change my application to consume from those other databases without going here to do it, right? Also, you'll see here the service broker feature is not supported in Azure SQL DB. Okay, so again, this is from my assessment. I'm going to cancel out of here. I'm going to come back to Azure SQL Managed Instance. I'll show you what happens if I click on Get Azure Recommendation. Again, still in preview, but I can tell it to save performance data from a particular folder, or if you already have it, which the documentation can tell you how to get, you can just browse for those files and let this thing assess them. Okay. So let's go back to View Select. I'm just going to select a couple of databases here. We'll skip my Wide World importer since it wasn't compatible. Let's just take my SQL Nexus and my AdventureWorks. No, why not take all three of these? We'll select. All right, so it's going to take me, now that I've selected, you can see a nice little summary, 4 out of 7 databases. I'll click on Next. And now I need to connect up to Azure. Okay. So I currently have a linked account. If I needed to relink an account, or if this is the first time I'm doing this and linking up to Azure, I'll click on Link Account and I'll log into Azure. It'll pop up a window for me. I will log in right here, sign into my Azure account, and then it's done. And when it does that, like I said, it'll look like this. So now it's added. Okay. So I'll close that. I've got a linked account. Pick my subscription, pick my location. I'm going to come back here and double check my managed instance location. This is in East US, so I'll go ahead and make sure that I do East US. It found the resource group. Notice if I choose a different, it's probably not even going to let me choose a different region because it knows already by looking at my subscription that I don't have anything that I can migrate to that's a managed instance in those other regions, right? So it's doing all that work for me. This is my resource group. You'll notice there's not going to be another resource group because I only have one managed instance in one resource group. And then finally, my managed instance name. Click Next. I'm going to go ahead and do an online migration so you can see some of the status here. But it also gives you a little reminder. Application downtime is limited to cutover at the end of the migration with an online. With offline, application downtime will start when the migration starts. Click Next. Where are my database backups? They can be either already up in an Azure Storage blob container. Maybe I've already been backing up there for redundancy purposes, right? I have a number of customers who will back up to URL. That's typically Azure Blob Storage, right? Or some other URL, but in this case, we can only use Azure Blob Storage or our network share. So I'm going to use a network share, which is here on my local machine to simulate on-premises network share. Okay. I will have to enter my credentials in, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. 1 second, I'm going to place the mic down. Okay, hopefully that was correct. And then I have to, basically, in my case, I'm going to use these same credentials for the network share, but you may have a different one, right? If you have a separation of duties, you may have a different network share admin username. So give me a moment. All right. So it already pre-populated my database names. I will have to give it the network share path. So I'll do that once and then copy it. SQL backups, and then I'll put in my database name, which in this case is SQL Nexus. SQL Nexus. Yeah, it's fine. Did I spell it right? It's good. Oh, I see what you're saying. Thank you. Never type in demos, they say. But I kind of had to do this demo. Okay. Now I have to provide details about my storage account. Okay. So in this particular case, I have a storage, a resource group and a storage account that I do not want to use. So this is the one piece of this outside of your virtual machine or your managed instance that you do have to have created. So I'm going to jump out here really quickly, create myself a storage account. You may have already had this, or you may have one that you want to use, but in this case, I'm just going to create a quick one in the same resource group. East US. I'll go ahead and do standard. Let's try to keep the cost down. Next. 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 And create. So this will only take a moment. Once it's done, I can go ahead and refresh. Right? So what's really nice about this is everything, for the most part, is being done through the tool, especially the configuration. Now, just for the record, there are some PowerShell scripts out there, and there are links in the documentation if you want to fully automate this process. Right? So to make it even easier, I like automation. I like repeatable processes being done in scripts. And you can do this all with PowerShell. So let's see. It's there. Not yet. Okay, so it's MIRGJJK. Oh. So let's actually, maybe we'll take a step back, come back. Well, that's not cool. It's not seeing it. Probably because I created it and we were already in here and it's cached. That's okay. We're just going to go ahead and use this. Next. All right, so the last thing I have to do now, this is going to create a new database migration service for me. So this is the service in Azure that is going to interrogate my backups and restore them appropriately for me. So I'll go ahead and create this in the same resource group. Still loading. Come on, interwebs. Okay. Sorry, I realized I don't have a migration service. So in order for it to even find a resource group, I have to click on the create new. Okay, so we'll go ahead and we'll create this new in my resource group. We'll call it JJK. Database migration service. And we see here the target is Azure SQL. Azure SQL is a generic term for virtual machine, managed instance. So now it's going to create this service. And notice what it does here at the bottom. This is real important for on-prem stuff, or if we have to somehow traverse a VNet in the cloud. This gives me a link to download and install something known as the self-hosted integration runtime. I'm going to install that really quick while I'm talking. What this integration does is it creates a link using a key, right? So a secure key with an encrypted connection between your on-premises network and the Azure Data Migration Service. This key is specific to wherever I install this, because I'm going to take that key, which was generated by the service, and put it into wherever I install this. So the only two things that can ever talk to each other are these two services. Okay. So I'll go ahead and download that. So it'll take a moment to install. So if I jump back here while that's downloading, you'll see I've got key 1 and key 2. Why are there two keys? I get asked that sometimes. For key rotation, right? So you can have a second key that you put in there. You don't invalidate a key and then generate key number 2. You can also back up these keys, which is strongly recommended. You can change the keys in the service. So if you to create a new Azure data migration service that generates a new key, you can use a PowerShell script to come back to this local instance where I installed the integration runtime and change the key. So now I can use this integration runtime to authenticate with a different Azure service. Because like I said, it's like one-to-one, and that's for security reasons. Okay. So that guy's downloaded. I'll go ahead and run it. The integration runtime should typically be installed on a virtual machine in your on-prem network or the network that does have direct communication with your SQL servers or your sources. Okay. The closer it is in terms of network to that SQL server, the better, because all traffic is going to have to be routed through this new VM. You can install it on a SQL instance. We don't typically recommend that because now we've got two services and this one's doing work, right? But let's say you've got a virtual machine SQL server on-prem. If you can put this VM that runs this on the same virtual host, on the same VNet, that would be best, right? So this is going to go ahead, do an install, and part of the configuration then is going to go ahead and ask me for this key that was over here. So I'll go ahead and copy this. There's a nice little copy button. Oops, which one? Okay, this one's installing, so that one's going. Good to go. For all those remotely, in case you didn't hear, the question was, is this also doing integration services jobs? And no, the answer is it's not. It's strictly databases. It's also not migrating your logins or any of your system level objects or permissions. Okay. So that's something we'll still go ahead and use, things like SP Help Rev Login, if that's what you like to use for logins, and MSDB, right? You're going to need to export your jobs and import them as well. I'm not saying that that may not come in the future. I'm sure there's some plans to make this more and more kind of enterprise or full scale. It's just not there yet. And this is probably the most painful part, right? So they figured, all right, let's tackle the painful part first. Here you'll see this integration runtime is where I paste that key, and then I click on register. So what I want to see here is that this thing is going to go up there and give me a nice good old green, I'm registered and good to go. Then I'm going to jump back to my Azure Data Studio, click on test connection to make sure that it can read everything. And what is that doing? It's actually going up, asking the Azure Migration Service if it has a connection to the integration runtime, right? Because what Migration Studio is really doing is it's talking now, when we get to this point, to the migration service. We can see here that it's been registered successfully with the green check mark. So I'll go ahead and click close and then click on test connection here, and we are good to go. So we'll go ahead and click on done. Now it'll fill in these blanks for me. If I had an existing migration service that I set up through this process, it'll show up again here. There are ways to go out there and create the Azure migration service and then come back and do this. It seems to me to be easier and run into any kind of, you don't see the same hiccups as you might if you just let this thing create it for you, because it's probably running some permission scripts or configuration scripts to make sure that it's set up appropriately to interact back and forth. Okay. So I'll go ahead and click next there, and look at that. A nice little summary. I can save this and close it and come back to it if I want, or I can go ahead and start. So let's click on start migration, and immediately I get some errors, and that's unfortunate. But the nice thing is I should be able to go to my migrations, refresh. Got a bad request on something, so let's see. Invalid argument. Account key. Something failed on me here. Not good. All right, so that failed pretty quick. I'm gonna go ahead and try to do this one more time. I'm just gonna do it with a single database for the sake of making this easier. Go down, select it. Okay, let's go back to my resource group, East US, MIRGJJK. There we go, next. Online migration, next. Oh, my guess is it might have been that network share it was trying to communicate with on storage. So we will try this again. Okay, everything's looking good. I'll come down here. We're gonna change this now. I've got my storage account appropriate. So again, I should have created that first. It's a good note for the prerequisites. I'll throw that in there in the slide. Now we can click on next. The service is still there, notice, right? So I don't have to recreate this. And we'll start my migration. Yay, starting migration. So we can see here, I got a little dashboard. If I want to see the progress, I can click on it there, which just took me to this migrations tab, right? It's just a short link. We'll come over here. We see this thing is still creating. Oh, and I get a failure. All right, so this is the problem with doing demos. It looks like it could not connect to my file share here. JKP53S SQL backups. Yeah, everything was spelled right. It just, for whatever reason, couldn't find it. I'm gonna see if I can give this one more college try and see, did I? JKP53S. Oh. All right. I am gonna do this one more time. I know what the issue is. Close that guy. Come back here, and we will go ahead and do one more migration. I had the wrong file path in there. I missed folder. So let me make sure if I copy that, will it actually take me to a share? That's a good way to verify it. There we go. All right. Now we should be ready to rock and roll. Okay, so it's going. If I go ahead and click on this, it's creating. I'll click on the database. And just to kind of double check, I can jump up to my storage account that I created and see what it's doing. There's a container. Right now, there's no blobs there. My backups will be placed into this container. Let me go over here. I'm going to also go and look at my migration service in Azure. It's the wrong account, so we'll flip. So I can go here and monitor my migration. Looks like it's online. The migration, not my database yet. Heck, while we're here, we'll go and open up one more portal to my Azure SQL Managed instance. And right now there's no databases, right? So we're still in the process. Let's refresh this guy. Uploading full backup. See that? So the good news is that means it found it. Okay. Which also means if I come back here to my container, we're going to have one in a minute or two. Right? So again, what is this doing? It's going out, the Azure Migration Service has a link to my on-prem file share through the self-hosted integration runtime. Okay, so that's a secure link. It is going to pull those backups up into Azure into that blob storage container, which just acts like a file folder, right? When it gets up there, which there it is, it's my full backup, right? Notice if I look at the properties of the file name, it's the same file name as my local file here, right? So that's good. Everything's matching up. It got up there. Now let's jump over to my managed instance, which had no databases. And we can see that the database is there. It's in a restoring state. If you guys like Management Studio, here's what it looks like here. If I refresh this, you can see there was nothing there. When I connected, let's refresh, right? We get a restoring. You're familiar with seeing that. That's what a restoring database looks like, right? Notice if we come back over here to my local instance, nothing going on, right? It's still online, it's ready to go. So we'll come back to my migration. We'll refresh this. It shows that we've got these two active files, right? I wasn't able to get the log to back up. That's okay. So we're restoring the full database backup. What does this differential say? That's interesting. Type, differential database, status, arrived, data uploaded, 0. Huh. If I go back up into my portal, go to the storage account, refresh it. That's over here, right? We will see the differential backup with a size of 0 bytes. All right, so what do we do now? Notice that this complete cutover just showed up for me. because it noticed that all of our files that are in my local backup folder, all of my files that are up in Azure are in sync. So I can click on complete cutover. It's going to give me a wonderful warning window, right? Stop all incoming transactions to the source database. Create a final transaction log backup and store it somewhere. Well, on the network share, sorry, so that it can get pulled up. And then verify again that all log backups have been restored on the target, right? So we can actually see, it'll tell you if there's any log backups here. Let me show you what I like to do. I like to take something known as a tail log backup, okay? For those of you who don't know what that is, I can back up the transaction log. And let's back up to, let's see, SQL backups. Yep, everything's there. We're going to remove that file. We're going to rename it to tail log.trn. I am in the wrong folder, so let me jump back to that. Okay, so now we're there, tail log. Click on OK. Okay, now this is going to be my final backup. So you'll see here, back up the tail of the log and leave the database in the restoring state. I've talked to a lot of people, and it took me years until somebody explained this to me. A tail log backup is a backup of the transaction log with no recovery, which puts your database into a restoring state. It stops transactions from coming in. It allows you, if you need it to fail back, usually, not in the case from managed instance, I just want to be clear on that, but from another SQL server, you could come back to this and start applying transaction logs to it because it's in a transactionally consistent state. All right? So that's what we're going to do. Why am I going to do this? Because it guarantees, from my point of view as a DBA, that nobody's able to write to this database. Okay? So we're taking the tail log back up. I want to make sure that there are no open windows because that will cause it to fail, right? Yep, see, it failed because I had an open connection. Let's just try it again. I may have to do it with a rollback. Come on, man. I should have this pre-scripted. All right, I'm going to come out here. Don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to try it. If it doesn't work, I'm just going to leave it. And then we'll go ahead and complete cutover. All right, but I like this tail log option. Some people are like, oh, I put my databases into read-only mode. That's fine if you want people to still access them, but they can't write to it, right? But I really like this tail log backup because in some cases, I can come back and apply transaction logs. All right, so we're going to skip that. And we'll just go ahead here. Right? I confirm there are no additional log backups. So even though it sees that there's nothing there, it's basically saying, but Jarrett, do you need to take one more? Like, are you sure you want to do this? Because there's no going back, right? Complete cutover. So there I go. I do that. Now, just to be clear, when this is done, I'm going to have a database and managed instance that is fully operational, right? The question is, what's going on with the source database right now? Because I did not take a tail log backup, it's online and still doing everything that it was doing before, right? If I was doing a migration, hopefully I've disabled logins. Again, for me, I take a tail log backup. There are those people that take the database offline. You can do that before you do that, as long as the log backups and everything are there, right? So there's a number of steps that you want to do to secure your production side. In this case, because I wasn't able to get all the connections ceased for the tail log, it's still online and going. So the service itself is not going to take care of that for you, probably for good reason, right? What if somebody accidentally clicked that button? It was pointed to prod and they thought it was dev. At least they didn't tank prod, right? They're going to have to redo everything on the target, but that's it. If I come back here and look at my dashboard for my migration and refresh it, Azure Data Studio is going to show me that I have 1 complete and 0 in progress. If I jump out to my portal, my migration service, if I jump back to the main page, should show me the same thing. Where's my monitor? Let's come here. Right here, migration status succeeded, right? There was also that monitor dashboard. Oh, that's okay. Right. So that's it. Any questions? Right, so the question was, earlier I decided not to migrate my wide world importers database because it wasn't compatible with SQL Managed Instance. Is there something that can show me that? And the answer is yes. So see here, as soon as I select databases for assessment and click on next, right here, you can see it shows 0 out of 1 databases can be migrated. So none of them without issue. So if I go and take a look at this, again, I will select this, scroll down and click on View Select to view the assessment results. And when I click on the database, it shows me here. Right? So if I just come on over here, Azure SQL Managed Instance General Purpose Service Tier does not support in-memory OLTP. And it shows me all the objects. Right? Nice little description here and a recommendation. Notice what it says. It does say you should either choose the business critical tier, which will support this. Okay, so it's just a warning, right? It's not going to stop me from moving forward. I don't remember exactly what happens when you restore a database that is using in-memory OLTP to a GP. I haven't tried it. My guess is either the restore is going to fail, or the first time somebody tries to access that table, it'll fail. Right? But typically, right, in-memory OLTP has its own file group. You can have multiple database files and file groups in MI. You just can't say where they are. You just create file, right? So yeah, good question. Any other questions? So the question is, this is one way to get your Azure or your data into Azure Managed Instance. Is another way to set it up as a cold standby? The answer is yes. So Azure SQL Managed Instance can be set up as a secondary, or really what it uses is something called Azure SQL MI Link that acts very similar to an availability group. It's built on top of the distributed availability group architecture, and it can replicate your data from the instance up into managed instance. Okay. Prior to SQL Server 2022, it was strictly for read scale or migration purposes. So you fail over once and not come back. As of SQL Server 2022, you can now have the ability to actually use SQL Managed Instance. I'm just throwing this out there as a Microsoft employee, as a failover and fail back. Because what they do is they lock down the database version, which typically isn't locked down in Azure because you want the latest and greatest all the time. So they change major versions. And what can't you do with SQL Server? You can't restore backward, right? You can always go up, you can't go backward. And so that was the problem with failing over. They give you now the availability to choose when you deploy your managed instance, do you want this to be locked down as a failover disaster recovery instance for SQL Server? Yes. If you do that, you won't get those latest and greatest version upgrades of the database, but you can have the ability to use it as a DR failover failback. Yes, 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 yeah, yeah. I do not know. My assumption, well, number one, it's built on AGs, so I'm guessing it's 2012. But don't quote me on that. I'm sure that documentation is out there, but it is built on availability group architecture. It's also, as I understand it, built on distributed availability group architecture, so it may be 2016 or later. But I'm sure there's some documentation out there. Any other questions? Good question. All right. Well, that being said, I went a bit over time, so thank you for bearing with me. For those of you who want to go back and watch the video, we'll post it to our YouTube channel and have it edited so that we're not waiting forever while I'm downloading and installing stuff. But hopefully that little bit of time that it took today will give, when you get to that point, if you get there, will kind of refresh your memory on some of the little things that I did during that process. So again, thank you for coming to the Chicago Data Professionals December 2022 meeting. And I am Jared Karney, the presenter. I'm also, I'm also a co-chapter group leader, along with my partner in crime, Ross. Say good night, Ross. All right. Thank you so much.